Well, good day to you. My name is Dion Forster, and I'm a professor of systematic theology and ethics at the University of Stellenbosch. And I also serve as the director of the Bayes Naudé Center for Public Theology and as one of the editors for the International Journal for Public Theology. And I have a particular interest in issues of faith and public life. And today it's going to be my privilege to speak to you about the relationship between public theology and science. Now, my interest in this topic goes quite a long way back. My very first degree, the first degree that I was registered for when I finished school, was a Bachelor of Science degree. And my first PhD, which I completed in the early 2000s, was in cognitive neuroscience and looked at the brain and identity and African relational ontology in African theologies. So I've always had this very, very deep interest in the relationship between theology and science. And I must say, at the moment, I think this is a particularly important thing to think about. Now, as you can see, as I record this, I'm not in my office at the university, I'm in my home. And that's because we are still under lockdown in South Africa because of the coronavirus pandemic. And being interested in the relationship between theology and science has been a particularly fruitful enterprise at this period in history, because we've seen how people of faith in many contexts around the world have been disregarding science in relation to this particular virus and how it spreads. People refusing to wear masks. I remember, for example, right at the beginning of the pandemic, some colleagues in South Africa, ministers, clergy, pastors of churches, not wanting to shut down their congregations. I remember receiving a message forwarded to me on WhatsApp from a minister saying we need to meet to show that we have faith and that this virus will not be greater than us. Now, immediately in that particular view of science, so someone who is taking a perspective like that, we can see that their view of theology and science, of faith and science, is oppositional. Somehow they have got into their heads, into their minds, the understanding that there must be a conflict between science and faith, and that the most faithful thing to do is actually to combat science. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to introduce you in the next number of minutes to a number of ways in which we as public theologians might engage science, the importance of engagements between faith and science, and hopefully just help you to think a little bit about how, as a theologian, perhaps as a faith leader, perhaps as a person of faith, you might engage this important issue. So there are at least 4 ways in which we can see throughout history that there has been an engagement between theology and science, between faith and science. And we're going to define those terms a little more clearly in a moment. But just to say, to start with, the 4 characteristic ways in which faith and science have engaged one another is, first of all, a model of conflict. Now, that's the example that I just gave you on COVID-19 is one example of that. But we've seen, for example, how Copernicus and the Copernican revolution in history, how the church, because the Bible had said that humanity and the earth were the center of God's universe, how they took that to be a sort of scientific reality. And when Copernicus, who was an astronomer, worked out that in fact the center of our solar system is the solus, the sun, there was this conflict between them. And it was only a number of years ago, I believe in the 1980s, that the church confessed that it was in error, that in fact the science was correct and their interpretation of scripture might have been somewhat problematic. We see it also, for example, in groups like the creationists, those who believe in a strict 6-day creation narrative, 24 chronological hours for the creation narrative, and treat the Bible in that sense, and the narratives, creation narratives in the Bible, as if they are intended to be science. So that's the first way, conflict. The second way is what we call independence. Now, this is an approach where people tend to create a dualism between spirituality or faith on the one hand and scientific reasoning or knowledge on the other, and choose either just for measures of convenience or for ignorance, just to deny what is happening in another sphere. Now, the problem with independence, whether it's scientific independence or faith independence, theological independence, is that it doesn't take the whole of reality into account. Think about it for a moment. You can have every belief that you want in the world, but you cannot deny gravity. And the same goes for the scientist. I mean, the scientist may say, like people, for example, like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens and others may say that there is no such thing as religion, that God doesn't exist, spirituality doesn't matter. Well, that may be a claim, but certainly social scientists wouldn't agree with that claim. We can see the importance of religious belief, how it frames people's lives and offers meaning and helps them to make sense of it. So that measure of independence, scientific or theological, also doesn't seem to work. Another model that we have, and this will be one of the ways in which we'll talk about today, is the dialogical model, where persons with a faith perspective and persons who take primarily a scientific view of the world may enter into dialogue with one another and see what they can learn from each other and how they can deepen and thicken and enrich their understandings of the world. And then, of course, the final model, which is the one that we see happening particularly in theology and science and in natural theologies and theologies of nature, is what we call the integrative approach, where we come to recognize the importance of different approaches to understanding and conceptualizing reality, and we integrate them. So we're going to drill down into those a little bit more. But let's get to the next point in our discussion, and first of all ask the question, what exactly do we mean when we speak of science? Well, one of the things that we do realize is that people have a hunger for knowledge, a hunger to understand, to grow, to learn and know. And science is often the way in which people come to try and understand the universe. For example, how do currents in the oceans work? How do human bodies grow? How do chemicals work in our brains? These are some of the things that people want to know about. So we know that certainly throughout history, the physical sciences, the biological sciences, and the social sciences have been a tremendous, tremendous benefit to our lives. For example, we've learned how to have a better diet, to get more nutritious foods. We've developed technologies that aid us, for example, in medical science, to save people's lives, to lessen suffering. We've also, unfortunately, developed views of the world which have been completely devoid of the notion of dignity and respect and sacredness. We've entered into what Charles Taylor would call a sort of disenchanted world, based on that phrase of the sociologist Max Weber, where we've come to regard the world only in scientific terms. I'll always remember reading that beautiful book by Bede Griffiths, The Golden String, where how he had been raised in a sort of scientific, humanist kind of paradigm, for the first time came to experience that not everything that matters in life can be weighed or counted, but that some things are just to be appreciated, that there's an aesthetic quality to the universe. So science clearly has contributed towards human development and understanding. And we've also seen the converse, like, for example, the example I gave you earlier, how anti-scientific or non-scientific approaches to reality in the world have harmed persons and societies. How we've seen, for example, in places like Brazil and the United States, anti-scientific views related to the coronavirus have led to massive infections amongst vulnerable populations who otherwise might have been protected. So we can see science matters. Now, the third thing that I want to say about this notion of science when we speak about science is that it is a particular way of viewing the world, and therefore we can recognize that science has a particular set of disciplinary distinctives. So, for example, the scientific method is often engaged in the pursuit of a particular way of finding out what is true, what is real, what can be trusted. It has particular ways of seeking that truth, what we often call an epistemology of science, a very empirical, data-driven way of knowing the world. I remember, for example, when I was doing my studies in neuroscience, you would have a hypothesis, and then you would develop an experiment to test that hypothesis. And if you found results, you would then repeat the experiment again under the same or very similar conditions to see, do you get the same results? And that kind of scientific method was built on rationality, on reason, on data. It was very much that kind of way of understanding. And of course, the scientific method has certain intentions. Whereas, for example, in spirituality, we may pay attention to things like beliefs and the wholeness of the human person. In science, very often it's around, data and discovering, how do different physical properties operate. So the intentions of science sometimes even differ from other specific approaches. Now, the one thing I do want to say about science when we're answering this question, what does it mean to speak of science, is that we must be careful that we do not somehow suggest that science is superior to all things. And this has been one of the challenges of the Enlightenment age, is that somehow we've come to believe that science is superior to everything, that the scientific method trumps all other forms of knowledge and reasoning and understanding. And of course, we can see that that's not true. Some of the real challenges that we've had in the last centuries, for example, the two great wars where we used our scientific ability to destroy one another. We're seeing it now with the climate crisis, where we've so developed ourselves and our technologies that our carbon emissions and our carbon footprint are making life difficult, destroying the environment, dishonoring creation, not providing justice to creation. So we need to recognize that there are other forms of knowledge that are also true, but can be true in different ways. I'm always reminded of the importance of science when I read the scriptures as well. The scriptures are in fact full of references to the importance of different forms of knowledge. Take, for example, the Apostle Paul writing to the Christians in Rome, trying to present himself to them in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 to 21. He offers a sort of natural theology. He says that all people can know who God is because God has made God's self plain to them, verse 19. Verse 20, because God, for since the creation of the world with its invisible qualities, God has made God's eternal power and divine nature. Paul goes on to write that it can clearly be seen, that it can be understood from what is made, so that people are without excuse. A very important book that was written, and I don't have it here, I wish I could show you the cover, was a book by a guy called Peter Harrison, which traces the emergence of the modern scientific method. The book is called The Fall of Man and the Rise of Science. And it shows how, as we began to recognize the importance of different ways of understanding, we began to recognize that religion helps us to answer very important questions, but it cannot answer every question, that there are some questions that we do need to have a scientific approach to. For example, if you're wanting to build a bridge and you're starting from two opposite ends on a cliff, you can't build that bridge just by faith and hope that the two parts are going to line up. You need physical sciences to be able to work out what is the angle, so that you don't allow the bridge to sag. How much tension can the particular materials that you're using withstand? So you need a particular method of knowledge to do that. Okay, the third question that we want to answer in this particular series, as public theologians in particular, is to ask the question, how do we approach a public theological engagement with the sciences? If faith matters and science is important, then as public theologians in search of what is good and what is right, what is true, what is wise, how are we to approach this? Well, I'm going to base, in large measure, my comments on the views of a very important public theologian called Heinrich Bedford Stroum. And he gives us sort of 6 characteristics that are quite common in contemporary public theologies. And I'm going to say a word or two about each of those characteristics and how they relate to theology and science. First of all, Heinrich Bedford Stroum reminds us that public theology is theology. We're not involved in political science. We're not involved in natural science. That there are people who are good at those things, and we need to be careful that we don't present ourselves as experts in disciplines that we are not. So remember that our task as public theologians is to ask the theological questions. We need to be very, very cautious of doing what is known as pseudoscience. Pseudoscience means it's not quite science, it's not quite true. And I see many theologians doing this. And this is dangerous. It devalues the importance of theology, but it is also incredible, not credible, for those who understand the scientific paradigms. So the first thing I want to encourage you to recognize is that as a public theologian, your responsibility is to work in the discipline of theology, to ask theological questions, to use the tools and resources of theologies, the scriptures, the traditions of our faith, our reason, our experience, all of these tools in order to do theology. And in this regard, we often facilitate a conversation between a number of different questions. Firstly, we often ask ontological questions. So what is the form of the nature of reality, and what can we know about it? And some of those things are deeply theological in nature. We're trying to discover what is reality. How do we know about it? What do we know about it? The second is the epistemological question. So firstly, the ontological question as a theologian. Second is the epistemological question. That is to ask the question, what is the nature of the relationship between the knower and what we want to know? So how do we understand this world in which we live? What kind of approaches can we take? And that leads to the third question. So we've got the ontological question. What do we want to know? Secondly, the epistemological question. What is our relationship between ourselves and what we want to know? And thirdly, we have the methodological question. How can the inquirer go about finding out whatever she or he wants to know? And this is very important. Now, the second characteristic that we have in public theology, which leads on from the first one. So first of all, remember, we are to be theologians. But the second characteristic is that Heinrich Bedford Sturm says we are often, as public theologians, engaged in what he calls multilingualism. So the capacity that we should have as public theologians is to be able to translate what we believe into the language of others, so economists or scientists, so political scientists in the social sciences, or physical scientists or biological scientists, to be able to translate our questions and our knowledge into their language, but also very often to bring the kinds of ideas and discoveries and understandings that come from those sciences and to translate them into our language. To be able to say to people, we've discovered in the sciences, for example, that, there is this virus called the, COVID-19 virus, and that this particular virus attacks the body in certain ways. And so for us as persons of faith, the question is to ask, well then, if we believe that creation is good, if we believe that our intention is to protect and safeguard human life, then what should we do in order to achieve that particular aim? How do we deal with the knowledge that we're getting from the sciences? So this issue of translation is a very important one, being able to translate in both directions, from faith into science, but also from science into faith. And my experience has been that some of the best public theologians are persons who can host credible and meaningful conversations. So for example, my friend, Professor Torsten Meyreis, very often at the Berlin Institute for Public Theology, will host conversations where there are scientists present. We do the same thing at the Bayes-Nadia Center for Public Theology. We invite persons who have knowledge in their specific field to come and speak to us, to tell us things that they know. And then we discern them. We try to listen carefully. We try to figure out what intelligent and careful questions can we ask in our pursuit of knowledge. So that's the multilingual nature of public theology. Thirdly, we know that public theology, according to Heinrich Bedford Sturm, is often interdisciplinary in nature. So this is a third one. It's theology, it's multilingual, and it's interdisciplinary in nature. Now, this means that, first of all, within the disciplines of theology, public theology is often going beyond one mere discipline. So I happen to be a systematic theologian. I also happen to be a biblical scholar. I have a PhD in New Testament studies. So I often work across those particular disciplines. I'll ask certain questions as a systematic theologian or an ethicist, but I might ask some different questions in relation to the scriptures. For example, in what ways might we learn from what we read in Paul's letters, as I did earlier in Romans chapter 1? Might we learn about a theology of nature? What does the Bible come to tell us about how we should treat nature, how we should respect one another, how we should honor God through the ways in which we develop technologies? So that's one way in which we do it. But public theology is often also transdisciplinary. So we don't only work in the theological disciplines, in systematic theology or church history, or in, for example, practical theology or missiology, Old Testament, New Testament. Very often we work outside of the disciplines of theology. So I have spent a lot of my time working, for example, with biological scientists, particularly with neuroscientists, people who understand the human brain. And there's some wonderful, wonderful research in this field. Andrew Newberg, Eugene de Quillay, people like Wenzel van Heijsteen, some wonderful theologians who are working with natural scientists in order to figure things out. Now, Ian Barber, who works in this field between theology and science, says when we think about interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, we should always be thinking in at least three categories. First of all, we have what is known as natural theologies. So this is where we look at nature and we ask questions: what can we learn theologically from observing and studying nature? So I often work with theologies. And in order to do that, I need to work with persons who understand climate change and carbon emissions, people who look at nature and can say, Dion, what we are learning from nature is X, Y, and Z. So that's a natural theology. We look at nature, we observe it, and we try to say, okay, what can we learn from God's revelation, what God is showing us through nature? The second way is what we call a theology of nature. So we can see that comes from a slightly different perspective. So that might be persons who, for example, look at how has the natural world been formed? What can we learn from our particular sources that might help us to enter into what we call a constructive theology of nature? I have, for example, a PhD student who's working on an ethics to deal with animal cruelty. So this is a theology which wishes to engage nature. What can we do and should we do in order to safeguard, in order to be responsible citizens of our planet, in order to be a responsible species that lives alongside other created species, trees and flowers and birds and animals? And then the final one is what we call a systematic synthesis. And Ian Barber speaks about this, that we need to be able to bring the knowledge that we have from our theological disciplines and the knowledge that we gain from the physical sciences, the natural sciences, the social sciences, and facilitate a meaningful conversation so that our knowledge can grow. Now, the fourth way in which public theology often deals with matters is, Heinrich Bedford-Strom says, public theology is not only theological in nature, it's not only multilingual in nature, interdisciplinary in nature, but often public theology is called upon to offer or provide a political direction. Now, what do we mean by political? We're not speaking specifically here of party politics. Rather, we are thinking of the word political much in the way in which it was understood originally, a polis. In other words, how do we structure our common life, not only our common life amongst humans, but our common life on this planet in such a way that we can work for the flourishing and justice of all of creation, non-human creation and human creation. So very often what we are trying to do in our theological work, particularly for those of us who are concerned about ethical issues, is we're trying to provide some political direction, to be able to say to church leaders, to be able to influence policy in governments, to say that there are better and worse ways in which we can live our lives. And of course, the religious theological approach to life is often very deeply based on ethics and morals and values. And so we have a particular contribution to make in that regard. Okay, the fifth characteristic that we have is that public theology is often prophetic in nature. Now, what do we mean by prophetic? Well, when Heinrich Bedford-Strom speaks of this, he has in mind the particular understanding of the prophetic that we get from the Hebrew scriptures, from the Tanakh, the Old Testament. The prophets of the Hebrew scriptures very particularly wanted to listen for the voice and the will of God. Now, this is one of the things I really want to encourage you to do, is to recognize that when we take that approach that I mentioned right at the beginning, that approach of independence or conflict, we are making God small. Somehow, theologians who do that are often saying the only way in which God can speak is through the Bible. The only persons that God speaks to is the church. The only way in which we can know things is through prayer or prophecy or visions or wisdom. And of course, we know, as we read in Romans chapter 1, that God is working in nature, that God is working in creation, in history. And we need persons with skill and insight and the ability to really understand those things, to speak to us, to tell us what they're seeing. Now, those persons may be persons of faith, they may not. I very often work with scientists who are sometimes even opposed to faith. And part of my role is to show them a more responsible way in which persons who hold faith deal with science. But part of it is also just to listen and to learn. So the prophetic quality, if we look in the Hebrew scriptures, was always the prophet listened for what was God saying. And often you'll see, particularly in the prophets like Micah and Amos, that they would say, "Thus saith the Lord, if you continue to live in this way, it will not go well with you. It will not go well with creation. So change the ways in which you're living." So public theology often wishes to offer that kind of a prophetic direction. It's a political direction, but it's based on listening for the will and the voice of God. What is God wanting us to do? Finally, this is the final point when it comes to theology and science. Theology and science in public theology is often intercontextual in nature. Now, when we speak about intercontextuality, this sixth characteristic, what we mean by that is, of course, the difference between the context of Berlin and the context of Cape Town, the difference between the context of Lagos and the context of Tibet. These are all very, very different contexts, and the ways in which persons approach life in the social sciences, for example, change between those contexts. One of the things I think public theologians need to do, particularly those of us who live in the majority world, African public theologians, Asian public theologians, Latin American public theologians, is that we need to remind our sisters and brothers in the West that the Western approach to knowledge is not the only way to understand the world. So, for example, indigenous knowledge systems. You know, in Africa, we have the most remarkable systems of knowledge that help us to steward creation, to care for it, to seek justice for creation. And we need to unearth those so that we can bring our contexts into conversation with the contexts of others, with Western sciences, for example. But there's another way in which we speak about intercontextuality, and that is between the universal and the particular. Now, the natural sciences often offer us what we would call universal principles. Gravity, for example, is a universal principle. No matter where you live in the world, that context will remain. If you walk off the third story of a building, you're going to hurt yourself on the way down. So that's a universal principle. But we can often ask the questions, what is the relationship between the universals and the particular? In what ways do these particular scientific discoveries that are being discovered, in what ways are they received? In what ways do they impact upon how people are living in particular contexts? I can tell you, for example, that our recovery rate from the coronavirus in South Africa has been incredibly high as 98%. And in part, scientists are telling us it's because we have a much younger population. It's because our populations have, unfortunately, due to poverty and disease, been exposed to many different forms of viruses. So our immune systems are quite different. So we're often having to think about the relationship between these things and what is the contribution and value that we can learn from the particular in relation to the universal. So just to remind you again of those 6 characteristics. Firstly, public theology is theological in nature. Secondly, it's multilingual. We translate, facilitate a conversation, host conversations. It's interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. Fourthly, a competency to provide political direction. Fifthly, it has a prophetic quality. It's listening for the voice and the will of God. And finally, it's intercontextual in nature. So here are 1 or 2 conclusions that I'd like to give you. First of all, I'd like to encourage you to recognize that it is imperative that we take the task of theology seriously. Theology in relation to science, it matters. We can learn things from science, and scientists can also learn things from theologians. I'd like to invite you to adopt a posture of humility, to listen, to read, to learn, and to think. But I'd also like to invite you to adopt a posture of being able to offer something, where our beliefs and our convictions can reasonably help to bring others to a development of knowledge and grow their understanding of the world. Let's not be afraid to offer it. So thank you for listening to this lecture today, to this introduction. And I'll make some resources available for you to read so that you can take your understanding of public theology and science further.